4. Next, the 25th anniversary observance of the Kent State University shootings. Former Senators Eugene McCarthy and George McGovern join R.W. Apple of the New York Times and 2 Kent State University professors in reviewing the events leading up to the shootings. On this date in 1970, Ohio National Guardsmen fired on students assembled on the university's commons, killing 4 and injuring 9. This program lasts nearly 2.5 hours.
Harry Kaplan, an emeritus professor of American history at Kent State, and I'm delighted to be back here today to introduce 3 distinguished speakers on the international dimension of the May 4th tragedy. I don't think it requires any leap of imagination to recognize that what happened here 25 years ago had implications that went much farther than Portage County or Ohio. I was in London on May 4th, teaching at the University of London, and a week later was invited to the American Embassy, where, as often is the case, the ambassador would have different groups of Americans over to a reception and a party. And in this case, it was American academics who were in London for the year. And we all had to go through the reception line in order to get to the bar. And we each were to introduce ourselves to the ambassador and his wife. And I did introduce myself and mentioned I was from Kent State University, and the ambassador said, "Where?" And his wife sort of nudged him and said, "You know." And he immediately passed me through to the bar without any further conversation. He knew what happened at Kent, and I think he recognized, at least a week after the incident, the implications of what occurred. We are fortunate today to have on our campus Mr. R.W. Apple Jr., Johnny Apple, and 2 former senators, George McGovern and Eugene McCarthy. Senator McCarthy is not yet with us. He will make maybe a dramatic entrance in the next half hour. We don't quite know when, but he will be here. Each of these panelists have made important contributions to the American experience in the 1960s. Both Senators McCarthy and McGovern were in the Senate in the 1960s, and the Senate in 1970. Mr. Apple, who will be our first speaker, is a member of the most influential national newspaper in the country. And he himself is arguably the most influential of the journalists on that newspaper, as former chief of the Washington correspondence and since 1986, and in the last half a dozen years as head of the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. He's traveled the world. He's written widely on so many different areas, including Vietnam, where he has had a personal experience. He's a graduate of Columbia University, where he received the magna cum laude degree. He's also a recipient of honorary degrees from a number of institutions in our state, and not least among his attributes is his nativity He is an Akron native. I'm pleased and honored to welcome Johnny Apple.
Thank you, Larry. Thank all of you. I'm delighted you're here. I think it's wonderful that Eugene McCarthy is late. He always bragged how early he was in 1968. Much of this country and most of the world had not heard of Kent State University before May 4th, 1970, but I certainly do not belong in that category. As Larry has said, I grew up just down the road in Akron. I went to boarding school just up the road in Hudson, and most of all, I spent 2 summers as a hod carrier on this campus. Not unlike some of you, I had spent more money than I had, and when I asked my father to bail me out of my college bills, he said, I have a friend who has a construction company, and you'll have a wonderful time making the money carrying hods in the Ohio sun. So that's what I did. I helped build a women's dormitory, whose name I have been told, and which I think I have probably got wrong, but it's something like Veeder Hall. Is that right? Verder. I knew Veeder wasn't right. But there's a very good Cabernet called Mount Veeder. That's probably why why the name has stuck in my mind. And I am never in Ohio, in northern Ohio at least, where my mother still lives and where I come to visit, without thinking of Kent State, because the first thing I do at Hopkins, of course, is rent a car, and the second thing I do is turn on WKSU. It is both an honor and a pleasure to be on a panel with my friends George McGovern and Eugene McCarthy. It is also a good starting point for what we're going to be talking about today. We live in an era of what I call neo-nihilism, when something approaching a hatred of Washington, politicians, and politics has taken over our life, our national life. There is a broad belief that they can and do change nothing, that they are interested only in their own careers and futures. Well, these two are living reminders that that ain't so. They are a reminder that you don't even, contrary to the Vince Lombardi's doctrine, you don't even have to win to have a major impact on American life. George McGovern had a major impact on American life, even though he lost the general election of 1972. Eugene McCarthy had a major impact on American life, even though he lost the New Hampshire primary in 1968. I don't want to sound excessively Presbyterian, but the reason they had an impact is not far to seek. They had an impact because they stood for something. This is a time of many anniversaries. I'm very aware of it because I've been involved in lots of them. Last June, I was in Normandy with the President for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. Extraordinarily moving ceremony when old soldiers came back to see where many of them had been wounded and many of their colleagues had died. Next week I will be in Moscow with the President for the 50th anniversary of the Allied victory in Europe in the Second World War. Earlier this month, was the 50th anniversary of Franklin Roosevelt's death in Warm Springs. This week we have been marking the capture of the prisoner of war camps and the concentration camps in the last days of fighting in Europe, the 35th anniversary of the Nashville sit-ins, which were the first prolonged and successful event of the civil rights movement, and now here, the 25th anniversary of the Kent State Massacre. I don't want to succumb to localism, but I would argue that in many ways, Kent State is the normative anniversary for our time amongst these several anniversaries. We don't have a lot in common anymore with the world of World War II, when there was a great crusade, a great international crusade that almost everyone agreed on, and which came out with a result that was entirely unambiguous. The fall of Saigon doesn't really have a lot to say to us, does it? Because now they're celebrating this event. We all bewailed it, bewailed what it meant for us and what it meant for Vietnam. It meant the end, one read, of our influence in Asia and in the world, and it meant the end of a decent life for the Vietnamese. Well, this week the co-sponsors of the celebrations in Saigon are the government and Pepsi-Cola. The city is full of signs, banners showing Ho Chi Minh and the hammer and sickle, but an equal, carefully allotted number of banners and pictures of the Pepsi-Cola logo. It was not the turning point that it might have been. But what happened here has stayed with us as a nation. In effect, the battlefield came to the campus. The Delta and the Iron Triangle came to Middle America. And that speaks so strongly to our present day, and I do mean present day in the literal sense, anxieties. You've been reading and hearing, talking and thinking about what happened in Oklahoma City. And I've been amused by the fact that so many pieces have said, we don't have violence like that in the American heartland. How quickly they forget. We do, and we have. Now as then, people talk about the slaughter of the innocents and quiet provincial lives shattered. It is as if there is no place to hide, but there was no place to hide 25 years ago. And that really was the greatest contemporaneous meaning then of what happened here. I think it is important to make one point very clearly, and perhaps several times. That is that the kids were right and their elders were wrong. They weren't right probably to burn down the ROTC building. I think ROTC, in fact, is a good thing for democracy. Keeps us from having an exclusively military caste running our armed services. But the kids were right because they saw that what the government said was on the line wasn't on the line. And what the academics and the journalists and others now see is this, But contrary to the domino theory, that idea that if we lost Vietnam, we would lose Laos and Cambodia. If we lost Laos and Cambodia, we would lose Indonesia and the Philippines, and pretty soon we would lose the world. Contrary to that theory, which General Eisenhower first put forward, and Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon believed in devoutly, Vietnam, the outcome of the war in Vietnam, had absolutely nothing to do with the outcome of the Cold War. It had no impact whatsoever. Pretty astonishing stuff when you think about it. I promised that I wouldn't tell you too many war stories today, but I can't resist telling you about the visit of a man called Bill Bundy. Bill Bundy was from one of those aristocratic New England families. His brother was the National Security Advisor, George Bundy, later the president of the Ford Foundation. Bill was the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and Far Eastern Affairs. He came to my house for dinner in Saigon. And I had a bunch of people there, as I did whenever I could get someone from Washington to talk to me and not exclusively to General Westmoreland. And Bundy went on and on about how we were on the verge of losing Indonesia and Australia and India and Nepal and whatever else he could think of. And after a while I said, you know, I have never met somebody from Washington who didn't believe that, and I've never met anybody in Asia who did believe it. And he said, well, the Asians are wrong. That mindset is something we must avoid, particularly as we move into an era when, if the World Bank's projections are correct, the largest economy in the world will be the Chinese, the third largest after us will be the Japanese, and India and Indonesia will also be in the top 6. Well, what did the protest here, looking back now, not from the perspective of 1970 but 1995, tell us? Well, there are a couple of things that it didn't do. It didn't end the war, which dragged on for years thereafter. It didn't change our politics enough. I don't like to bring up unpleasant subjects, but President Nixon was reelected in 1972. 2 years after the horrific events at Kent State, by a huge majority. Even though things were going badly in Vietnam, even though the attack on Cambodia, which directly precipitated the events at Kent State, had discovered no secret headquarters, and even though it was obvious that Nixon had no secret plan to end the war, as he'd promised in 1968. But it did shock out of a kind of apathy many people who had thought that opposition to the war among the young was confined to elites, and particularly to Northeastern and West Coast elites. As a Midwesterner, I regularly heard in those days that Middle America didn't share the views of Berkeley and Columbia and Harvard and USC. The Kent State affair gave the lie to that. This climactic event, and it was the climactic event of the entire protest movement, all that happened around the country came to a focus right here. Not at Berkeley, not in New York, but at a blue-collar school in what has always been considered the most typical, not the most atypical, American state. The state which most nearly mirrors in its economic makeup, in its ethnic composition, in its geographical position, the other 49 states. And that fact tended to bring a degree of unity to the opposition to the war which had not been present previously. The official reaction is fun to go back and read. It was fatuous in the extreme. Nixon and Rhodes, Governor Rhodes, Jim Rhodes, both said that this took place because of the violence of the students. And they said nothing about the governmental deceit, lying in other words, that had preceded it and which followed it. There was, of course, no sniper, at least as far as anyone was ever able to find. The guardsmen, as Senator Young said, within about 72 hours after the event, lost their heads. They were poorly trained. They were given weapons entirely inappropriate by grown-ups who should have known better. One who did know better was a man who, if I may be a bit waspish, has never struck me as one of America's great orators, never struck me as one of the most articulate men in American politics, John Glenn. On May 4th, 1970, I was in a single-engine plane bouncing around from town to town in Ohio with Glenn. He was running against Howard Metzenbaum for the Democratic nomination for the Senate. And we heard about these awful events as we were leaving Toledo. I asked him for a reaction, that being my line of work. As in, how does it feel, madam, now that your entire family has been wiped out in a plane crash? And he said, give me till Bowling Green to think about what I want to say to you. Fair enough. So we flew down to Bowling Green, and this is the clip of my story 25 years ago to, let's see, Wednesday from the Times. This is what he said. Everyone is losing confidence in everything. Our foreign policy, our universities, our electoral system. All because we haven't changed the things that needed changing, and we haven't told the people the truth. Not bad. Not bad then, not bad today. The biggest impact then and now, here and abroad, of what happened at Kent State was the extension of what happened in the Yadrang Valley and what was to happen in Watergate, of the culture of cynicism that has come to pervade our national life. We don't believe in government because they lied to us before. This is a profoundly dangerous thing for our country. It is the legacy of our failure to understand. Well, what is it that we didn't understand? How much have we learned lessons, perfectly or imperfectly? Well, one lesson, it would seem to me, of what happened here is that rhetoric sometimes produces results. There's a phrase that we use, oh, that's just rhetoric, meaning it's a bunch of hot air. Doesn't matter. It's not always true. Governor Rhodes came here 2 days before the events that we are commemorating and said that the student demonstrators were, quote, worse than the Nazi brown shirts and the communist element in our country. President Nixon, a few weeks before, had called the demonstrators bums. Vice President Agnew was making a living bad-mouthing them with the help, bad-mouthing them and us with the help of Bill Sapphire, his speechwriter, now a New York Times columnist. Have we learned this lesson today? That excessive rhetoric, particularly uttered by high officials, can have results? I wonder. We should have learned something about the danger of fighting foreign wars for domestic political ends. The memoirs of the era have made it clear that one of the reasons for the Cambodian invasion, which after all reversed the general course of our policy in Southeast Asia, we were slowing down, not speeding up, was that John Mitchell convinced President Nixon that he'd never get reelected unless he took a harder line. A third lesson, which we've seemed to have learned better than the others, is the futility, indeed the destructiveness, of trying to run a foreign policy partly through deceit without the backing of the public and the international community. George Bush learned that lesson in the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf War may not have achieved all that it set out to achieve, but it did not open up great rifts and canyons in our body politic because he learned that lesson. In a broader sense, I hope we've learned, I wonder, the importance of old fuddy-duddy academics and intelligence officers and specialists who actually know something about various parts of the world. One of the things that was clear in Southeast Asia was that we had almost nobody who spoke the language. Out of 325 foreign service officers who we had in Vietnam, 325 foreign service officers that we had in Vietnam in 1965, 2 of them were perfectly fluent in Vietnamese. We had very few people who knew much about the country. We didn't understand the differences between Vietnam and its neighbors, or we couldn't have considered them dominoes. And we certainly didn't understand the importance of nationalism and Ho's standing as a nationalist symbol. Did we understand Somalia very well? Broader question number 2. You cannot, broader lesson number 2, excuse me. You cannot build a nation, a political edifice, on shifting sand. There is no accepted structure in Bosnia, just as there was no accepted structure in Vietnam, and no amount of troops or peacekeepers can call it into being. Then there's the whole question of leadership. Very much at the forefront today, as then, because of Mr. McNamara's book, which my newspaper, as some of you may have heard by the grapevine, didn't like very much. Mr. McNamara says that in 1967, 3 years before this awful waste of life unfolded in the springtime, 3 years before, he'd decided the war was not only wrong but unwinnable, whether right or wrong. It's a long time, 1967 to 1995. Would it have made any difference? Well, it's nice to think that if he had resigned in high dudgeon, there would have been no Kent State. But I'm not sure that's true. Maybe it is true. Maybe because McNamara was such a powerful figure that the war was called during his time not Johnson's war, but McNamara's war. Maybe it would have made a difference. But we don't have a cabinet form of government in this country. In Britain, if a senior cabinet minister resigns and says this policy is wrong, as happened during the Suez Crisis, the government usually falls. In this country, if the president is stubborn enough to cling to his policy, even if his main advisor quits, he can cling to the policy. And whatever else you may, until he is beaten in an election. And whatever else you may think about Lyndon Johnson, I don't think that you would give him poor marks for stubbornness. I myself think that Secretary McNamara, whatever the impact might have been, was wrong and is wrong in maintaining that his highest responsibility was to the president. I think that in such extraordinary circumstances, his highest responsibility was to the country. Last, I would like to say that I fear that the kind of cyclical violence which was so evident during the Vietnam War, people being killed here because people were being killed in Vietnam and so forth and so on, is still with us. We have violence begetting violence on the streets of the city of Washington. We have, despite bright spots in South Africa and Haiti, recent bright spots in those two places, violence begetting violence on the world stage. And what could be a more awful but more relevant example than Waco begetting Oklahoma City? We have a lot of work to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that inspiring speech, Mr. Apple. Our next speaker is not an Ohio native. He's from South Dakota, but he has been to this campus in the past, and we appreciate his return today. Senator McGovern is not only a man of distinction as a principal opponent of the Vietnam War, but is also a scholar, a historian with a PhD from Northwestern University. But his life outside the academy, after teaching in South Dakota, had been for many years in Washington. He had been a two-term congressman and a three-term senator, covering the years of the Vietnam War. He has written books on the subject, particularly The Time of War, The Time of Peace, and his memoirs are called Grassroots. He was presidential candidate in 1972, and as Johnny Apple pointed out, while he may have failed to win the presidency in that election, his impact on America has been strong. I'm honored to be able to welcome Senator McGovern to our platform today.
Thank you. I think he may have wanted. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Kaplan, President Cartwright, my friend John Apple, who has just given us so many thoughtful observations, as he always does, both with the pen and with his public statements, and members of the Kent State University family. I hadn't realized that John Apple was a resident of Akron, to say nothing of him having been a hod carrier at this community. That probably explains why his muscles are so much bigger than mine. But I do have many pleasant memories of visits to Ohio, including being with you 5 years ago on the 20th anniversary of this occasion that we mark today. And I also recall JFK's rueful words on election night 1960 when he was the Democratic presidential nominee. He was watching the Ohio returns with special care, I suppose partly because there are so many electoral votes in this key state. And as the returns continued to come in, he turned to one of his aides and said, you know, Ohio gave me a lot bigger crowds during the campaign than they produced at the polls on election day. I confessed to some of the same results in 72, but I hasten to add that none of what the Speaker of the House refers to as McGovernics has either been jailed or impeached. I've often thought in retrospect, although I certainly didn't realize it at the time, that it was probably almost impossible during the height of the Vietnam War for a Democrat to be elected to the presidency. I think that Hubert Humphrey in '68 and myself in '72 both went down in considerable part because the Vietnam War literally ripped the Democratic Party in half. The doves sat on their hands in 1968, and many of the hawks sat on their hands in 1972. Somehow the Republican leadership managed to finesse that war by staying with whoever was the commander-in-chief of the moment, but Democrats fought it out on political and moral and economic grounds. John Apple referred to the recent tragedy in Oklahoma City. I was there a week ago speaking to the Oklahoma State Legislature, and two of the members took me to visit this devastated federal building. I'm frank to confess that I literally wept considering the dimensions of that tragedy, all the children and the hard-working men and women who toiled inside that building. And I agree with what was said here a few minutes ago, that words do have consequences. No one of us is going to suggest that anything said on the airwaves or in politics contributed directly to this tragedy, but I would only add my own conviction that I've been alarmed for many months about the growing tide of angry and bitter and sometimes hateful rhetoric directed towards the whole United States government. All of us have policies, federal policies, with which we disagree. That's what this meeting is all about today, the dissent against the Vietnam War, which I thought then and now was principled and required all the patriotism and courage we could muster to register that dissent. But this blanket endorsement of everything connected with the federal government and the scorn and contempt in which those who work for the government are held, I think does have consequences. And I hope somehow that there will be a sobering result from this recent experience that may cause all of us to take a little closer look at what we're saying publicly. The Kent State weekend of protest against the Indochina War 25 years ago began, as I think most of you know, just after President Nixon ordered the invasion of Cambodia, heretofore a neutral state with the Prince Sihanouk friendly to the United States. But in any event, it provided the backdrop for the protests on this campus a few days later. One of the students killed was Allison Krause. Her father, Pittsburgh steelworker, used to come to my office and just pour out his soul on how something like this could have happened in the heart of America. He would literally sit there, a big, strong man, weeping about this tragedy. And I think many of us here know there's nothing more sad than the loss of one of our children. It doesn't make any difference whether they're 18 or 5 or 45. It's a time of grief and loss when one of them goes, and particularly when it's in such a senseless act of violence as the one that claimed these 4 students here. Now, Vietnam, in my long-time judgment, was a tragedy that embraced many failings. I don't come here to identify anyone as war criminals or anything of that kind, but obviously there was a shocking ignorance, at the very least, on the part of the key policy makers of that war. I think many people felt when they listened to the dissenters against the war that maybe we didn't know some of the inside information that was available to the President, to the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State. Now we learn from Mr. McNamara's book that that's not true. A confession of ignorance on his part that I find astounding. I hasten to add that I'm glad he wrote that book. It helps clarify the historical record, and there are a few other people in high places that we deserve to hear some honest words from at long last. But I think one of the things that startled me the most was something that I thought was clear way back in the years when I was a graduate student at Northwestern University in the late 1940s. He said he came to understand that Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, that he was interested in Vietnam, that he was interested in the independence of his country, that he wasn't simply a stooge for Peking or Moscow. It's appalling to me that that wasn't known by the high officials of our government at the time they were making decisions to take us into this war. But Mr. McNamara, on that score, was no different than Presidents Truman and Kennedy and Johnson and their secretaries of state, all of whom bought that line that somehow we were in Vietnam to stop something that was then referred to as international communism. I think the reading of even one good book, many of which were available in the 40s and 50s and 60s on the history of Vietnam would have taught any person of average intelligence, and these men were above intelligence, above the average intelligence, should have taught them, if they'd taken the time to seek out such opinions, that we were up against an authentic nationalist revolution that was determined to rid the foreigners of Vietnam. And that should have been clear to us as far back as the Truman administration, when Ho Chi Minh, who had given his life for many, many years at that time to Vietnamese independence against the French and then later against the Japanese, was writing letters to the administration in Washington begging for meetings, for understanding, for some degree of acceptance and cooperation with what they were trying to do. I have no hesitance in saying here today that I've studied the life of Ho Chi Minh both then and now closely enough to believe that it's an authentic, honest, historical statement to say that notwithstanding his ideological differences with us, he was probably the George Washington of Vietnam. This is what I believe, that he was trying to eliminate foreign control of his country, even as we attempted to and did succeed in eliminating it in our revolution 200 years earlier. Now, Mr. McNamara, in my view, is still not raising the fundamental question about Vietnam. If you look at his book, he says there are 5 basic questions that we fail to ask about Vietnam. And if you look at those 5 basic questions, almost every one of them comes down to the question, can we win? The implication being that if we could have won, there should be no debate about sending 500,000 young Americans at 12,000 miles away from home, 10% of whom never came back. We shouldn't worry about the death of 2.5 or 3 million Vietnamese. The question, and you look at those 5 questions, they all come down to the central question in his mind that he thinks was the big mistake. We didn't ask hard enough, can we win? I don't want to overdo the analogy here, but to make the point, if Hitler could have won in World War II, does that entitle him to be considered a success? Would Saddam Hussein have been considered a success if he had won after the invasion of Kuwait? But more to the point, would we have been justified, even if we knew we could win, in engaging in this tragic war that killed so many young Americans, maimed another 300,000, and virtually destroyed Vietnam? I was a bomber pilot in the Second World War, and I shudder to think that we dropped more bombs on that little strip of jungle territory, which John Apple covered with such remarkable perception and discernment at the time, than all the bombs that were dropped on the entire world in the Second World War. I find that really a shuddering experience to think about even yet. The real question that should have been asked in 1945 or in 1954 or in 1961 or 65 or 69 is not, could we win, but should we even try? Is this a just cause? In other words, win or lose, were there sufficient moral, political, and economic reasons related to our national values and our national interest that would justify us going to war against Indochina and Ho Chi Minh? Of course he was a communist, but so were the Russians, our allies in the Second World War. So were the Chinese, now our most favored nation trading partner. So was Marshal Tito. of Yugoslavia, with whom we came to terms shortly after World War II. Certainly every bit as much of a communist as Ho Chi Minh, and yet he became a quasi-partner of the United States because he had shown some independence from the Soviet Union. But where is the evidence that Ho Chi Minh would have showed any less independence with an approach of cooperation and friendship on the part of the United States similar to the one that we extended towards communist Yugoslavia, to our advantage as well as to the people of Europe? Let me make one other point here. Ho Chi Minh never invaded Vietnam. You read the literature of Kissinger and all the others involved, and they talk about the invasion of the North into in the South. He didn't invade Vietnam. He was in Vietnam. That's where he lived. North and South Vietnam were not two countries. The 17th parallel was an armistice line behind which the defeated French were supposed to withdraw after their loss at Dien Bien Phu, and where the forces under Ho Chi Minh were to have withdrawn to the south, to the north of that line. But the documents at Geneva ending that struggle between the French and the Vietnamese made clear that this was not a political demarcation line. It was not designed to create two countries, and indeed, that same document provided for an election to be held 2 years hence on July 20th, 1956. Looking at that forthcoming election, President Eisenhower said that in a bona fide election, Ho Chi Minh would have won 80% of the vote in both the North and the South. So what about Mr. McNamara's claims that they thought they were carrying out the great traditions of the United States? Did you ever hear of a tradition called self-determination and bona fide elections and international agreements calling for such elections? Phony arguments have also been made that those of us who opposed this war were the isolationists. Those who supported it were the internationalists. Let me just say, since we're looking at some of the international aspects of this tragedy, that the United States was never more isolated internationally than when we were the deepest in Vietnam. The real internationalists were those who opposed the war, who believed that we did need to pay a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, that we did need to be cautious about the commitment of young life. I've always been an internationalist, although I'm frequently referred to as both an isolationist and a pacifist. Those are traditions that some people honestly follow, and I respect them. I just don't happen to have followed those traditions myself. I believe today, no matter what has happened in Vietnam, that the United States has to be actively involved in the life of the world. I believe in collective security. I believe in free international trade. Perhaps reciprocal trade is a more accurate word. I believe in the United Nations. I believe in some measure of assistance to the developing world, all of them the marks of internationalism. Now let me just spend a couple of minutes here on my experience with the Nixon administration with regard to the war. Much of the literature about Vietnam leaves the implication that the war more or less petered out after the Tet Offensive of early 1968. Not true. That war continued for another 7 years after that, and 40% of all the Americans who died there died during the Nixon administration, notwithstanding that President Nixon was elected on a pledge that he had a plan to end the war. But no sooner in office than the plan became clear, and it was one that took year after year to implement. I went to see Henry Kissinger, the National Security Advisor to President Nixon in early 1969, and I said something like this: Henry, You folks are not responsible for this war. You've just come into office implying that you have a secret plan to end it. Why don't you just say, the war was a mistake and we're going to terminate it as quickly as possible? He said, George, the war was a mistake. We know that. You've known it. I know it. But we can't pull out under these circumstances without setting off all kinds of domestic political repercussions here on the home front. He said President Nixon's chief constituency would go into orbit if we pull out of Vietnam now. He won in part because he's seen as a hardliner on standing up to communism. That's the way the war has been sold. We can't simply just admit mistakes and pull out and still govern this country. In other words, what I was being told by one of the masterminds of foreign policy in that period is that the war was a mistake. The realities of Vietnam argued against us being there, but we're going to continue to send people over there to kill and to be killed because we're worried about the domestic political consequences here at home if we pull out. I found that a sad and a frightening statement at the time. It seems all the more so today. And then we saw under this policy of Vietnam, that Vietnamization, that agonizingly drifted on for the next 5 or 6 years, various rationalizations for continuing the war. One was the argument that it was the only way we could achieve peace with honor. And the implication was that we had a number of political prisoners in Hanoi, a number of people missing in action, that the only way we could honorably withdraw from Vietnam was to wait until those prisoners were emancipated. Now, if you stop to think about it, that's not the way any war works. Prisoners are taken and held until the war ends. And then, ordinarily, they came home. And every year we continued the bombing, which accelerated all during this Nixon period. More planes were shot down, more Americans taken as prisoners. This was a formula for putting more Americans in prison, not for peace with honor. I was on one of the talk shows recently where we commented on Mr. McNamara's book. He had the first part of the period, and Senator John McCain of Arizona, McGeorge Bundy, and I had the last part of the program. And Senator McCain, to my surprise, since I've always had an amiable relationship with him, said, I want to say on this program that when I was in prison in Hanoi, I did not appreciate Senator McGovern's criticism of the war effort. Well, let me say to you that not once in all the years of dissent against the war did I ever criticize an American soldier or the American forces in Vietnam. They were not the policy makers. In a real sense, they were the victims of the war. And I said to Senator McCain on television, Senator, if the policies I was recommending in the early 1960s had been followed, you never would have been in prison, and 58,000 Americans would now be alive. Now, my principal effort during this period of the Nixon administration to stop the war was what was known as the McGovern-Hatfield Amendment. This was an amendment that I authored in conjunction with Republican Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon, still in the Senate, still a man of courage and integrity, that would have cut off all funding for any U.S. military operations in Southeast Asia after December 31st, 1970. It was introduced the day we invaded Cambodia. It came just a couple of days before the Kent State protests that ended in tragedy. and it became a kind of a focal point for the anti-war movement over the next year. We finally had a vote on that amendment on September 1st, 1970. It lost by a margin of 55 to 39. But all during that spring and summer, President Nixon and his cohorts, with the help of some Democrats, I must add, this war issue was always a kind of a bipartisan matter, orchestrated a campaign to discredit those protesting the war. Bill Sapphire, who's been mentioned earlier by John Apple, reports that the boss came to the conclusion in the spring of 1970, and I quote now, that his critics could be useful as the villain, the object against which all of our supporters could be rallied. End of quote. I regret to say that some of the anti-war people played into that scheme on the part of the Nixon administration of discrediting the anti-war movement as un-American, unpatriotic, and irresponsible. I recall leading a parade in downtown Atlanta with Mrs. Martin Luther King and the mayor of the city of Atlanta, the president of the United Auto Workers, and everything was going fine. It was a very peaceful parade. We were walking arm in arm, perhaps 15,000, 20,000 people in the parade, and many times that amount watching it. As we came in view of the cameras at a principal intersection, a young couple jumped out in front of the cameras and in front of the parade, right at just maybe 10 feet of where I was walking already, and announced a candidate for the presidency. And they had torn up the American flag. The girl was wearing a kind of a bikini-type outfit with shreds of the flag. The boy had on a, I guess you'd say a jock strap made out of parts of the flag, and carrying a sign, "Stop the War, McGovern for President." This is not helpful in but what Nixon did during this this period, and I want to just give you a couple of ideas on this. He stepped up dramatically federal police surveillance and harassment of the entire anti-war movement. He quietly ordered U.S. government security agencies to engage in things that some of which were clearly illegal: unauthorized wiretaps, burglary, the invasion of private files, and other harassing tactics. The CIA Operation Chaos, as it was called at the time, and the FBI's COINTELPRO were given the green light from the White House to engage in all kinds of activities designed to harass and disrupt and discredit anti-war groups across the country. At one time, one of the students of this period estimates that 40% of all FBI activity was directed at disrupting and discrediting the anti-war movement. In some cases, efforts were made to cooperate with various private vigilante groups in discrediting the anti-war citizens of the country. Recently, President Clinton made a speech out in Minnesota warning against explosive language that can trigger violence in this country. Rush Limbaugh replied the next day saying, "It's not people like Rush Limbaugh that are causing violence. It's people like George McGovern and the liberals who back in the 1970s shackled the FBI." There wasn't any shackling the FBI. The FBI can still make legitimate surveillance moves of the kind here with proper authorization. But indeed, steps were taken to end some of these abuses at the time. Now, just this final word. Two of the objectives of the Johnson and Nixon administrations that were the principal wagers of the war were to protect the political strength of those administrations here at home, and secondly, to increase the credibility of those administrations internationally. The rejection of war by millions of Americans and its bitter rift of the American political fabric actually, in the first instance, forced Mr. Johnson not to seek re-election and led indirectly to the Watergate scandals that forced the resignation of President Nixon. So they didn't succeed on the domestic front. Internationally, I think it's fair to say that this war diminished the stature of the United States all over the world. Almost nobody endorsed it. And I worried at the time about it so discrediting the U.S. role in the world that we would have difficulty mustering young Americans to participate in even legitimate international responsibilities in the future. It remains a continuing source of the cynicism and skepticism about official judgment and the integrity of our government that troubles us to this day. The manner in which the administrations plotted against and harassed anti-war Americans certainly reduced the moral stature of our government, both in the eyes of our own people and in foreign eyes. Now, looking back, as I said at the beginning, I'm reluctant to castigate the war planners as criminals or anything of that kind. And doubtless Mr. McNamara is right that given their degree of knowledge and the beliefs that they had at the time, they acted consistently with those beliefs and understandings of the time. It is perhaps prudent to conclude that these tragic American ventures of that period represented what Thackeray once described as the mischief which the very virtuous do.
You may think that Senator McCarthy was making a particular statement by coming in at this moment. I can assure you that the result of his delay was a plane cancellation this morning. It's a pleasure to be able to welcome Senator McCarthy here once again. He had been a member of the House of Representatives from Minnesota back in 1948 to 58, and a two-term senator from that state in the 60s. For us at Kent State, at least for me personally, he may not remember this, but he visited the campus at the invitation of two of his devoted campaign supporters among undergraduates back in 1968, who were also my students. They invited me as an unbeliever, perhaps, in the hope of certain conversion, to have dinner with Senator McCarthy, and I gladly accepted. These were two very bright young students who were clean for Gene, at least for this particular moment. And it was a delightful evening that I think the three of us remember, even if Senator McCarthy does not. And there's no reason why he should. But it is a particular pleasure to welcome him today to be with us. Thank you.
Well, I really was delayed by Continental Airlines, which explains why I've come in late. I wanted to be here to hear George and Johnny Apple. I especially like to listen to Apple because now that we don't trust the government, all we got left is the New York Times. You have to have some authority, and especially in international affairs. Well, I thought I might make some observations about how things came to happen as they did here at Kent State. You were sort of the last act of suppression in the country relative to the Vietnam War. The supporters of the war were rather pleased with themselves after Chicago. They thought they had taken care of the student uprisings, and if some of you may remember the acceptance speech of the nominee who said the majority had spoken. There was some question as to whether the majority had spoken, but when you're dealing with something like the Vietnam War, the majority doesn't really rule. It takes a much stronger moral imperative than a simple majority, which might prevail if you were talking about farm price supports or something of that kind. And then in the speech he talked about the politics of joy, which was difficult to understand under the circumstances. And it was not very well received, but it was sort of a move to say it's all over now and the Democratic Party has taken responsibility for the war. That was essentially what the convention was about. The Democrats had not accepted that war in '64. In fact, I ran in '64 for the Senate, and President Johnson was running saying he would not send American boys to do things in Asia that Asians shouldn't do themselves, and we won. And it wasn't long after that that the war was, well, some people said started. It was actually modestly underway before that, but was escalated. And Senator Morse was one of the more outspoken people. He began to call it McNamara's War almost immediately. Some of us, for several reasons. One, we say, Wayne, don't be so positive, and don't be so personal, and don't limit it to McNamara because there are others who are responsible. But in any case, it was an administration's war, and the Chicago Convention was really about the acceptance or having the Democratic Party accept responsibility for the war. And they resented particularly those whom they held responsible for making them do it. And I suppose this is classical, that no one really likes to be made responsible for something you don't want to accept. And this was laid on them, and they struck back at Chicago with some restraint. There was limited bloodshed and violation of practically every protection of the Bill of Rights, but other than that, they were restrained. And we went along with them, and they thought it was over. And then as things went on, the final protest was here at Kent State, and they terminated that with gunfire. And rather curiously, it came from the National Guard. And I've had some reservations about the Guard. The only kind of good thing about it is they keep some people from joining the Michigan militia. And the Guard satisfies some people in respect to their militarism. In the case of the Ohio Guard, actually, I never had anyone ask me to help them get a son into the Guard until Vietnam. And I wondered why it was, and I said, look, go to Canada or go to school, go to law school if you want to. And these things are a reasonable way, or be a CO, but don't join the National Guard. This was sort of the essence of what I thought was something close to hypocrisy, that you appeared to be very militaristic. You didn't have to go to Vietnam, and you could represent yourself as there to defend whatever dangers there might be at home. The students, particularly, were dangerous, but there were other dangers that you had to be concerned about, and you found people like Dan Quayle in the National Guard, and it was better to do almost anything except go to the National Guard, as was the case. And here on this campus, the final act was taken, that of finally shooting students, which had never happened before. It was sort of a period to the whole thing, and was the ultimate act of, I suppose, of definition. And you say, well, the Guard did it, but it was not the Guard acting separately. They were acting in context. It was sort of like, I think, Murder in the Cathedral. They knew that the president or whoever might be called upon would be happy with it. You didn't have to tell them to do it. There was no great outcry against it in high places in the government after what happened here in Kent State. And it bears upon, I don't know, I guess we politicians, George, have a right to kind of practice parapsychology just in self-defense, if nothing else, because we're analyzed, you were analyzed, and I was back in '68. I don't remember just what they said about you, but the liberals tried to be kind to you by attributing some kind of modest psychological disturbance. It's their way of being kind to you. Say, well, we didn't pass any moral judgment on, we just said he was paranoid, or something like that, which is sort of a detached judgment. And the conservatives began to attribute kind of traditional vices to me. And I got to liking them better for that. They said he hates people, which is not all bad. And then they attributed to me something called enmity, which I'd kind of lost track of that. I knew it had some standing in the Bible, but I got to looking at it and found, well, I'd accept that. If they'd settle for that, I'd say, okay, let's let it go with enmity. And it sort of stopped that kind of analysis. But there were strange forces running in Vietnam, psychological forces, the one that Chicago had made reference to of accepting guilt. And people don't really like to accept guilt. As the campaign went on before Chicago, there was a second manifestation which I think you have to keep in mind, and that was in the withdrawal of Lyndon Johnson from the campaign. And when he announced it, he said he was doing it so that he wouldn't be accused of politics for anything that he might do subsequently. And that sounded to me as though he might be going to end the war, which you could have said, well, that really proves that he was above politics, but he didn't do that. By withdrawing, he put himself in a position to exercise control over the issue. No matter what happened, he could control the Democrats or try to. If that failed, he was in a position to cooperate with whoever might accept his position on the war. And someone said it was a classical move. Lyndon did do classical things, but he didn't know it. It was his native genius and cleverness. But the classical act is to give up the office rather than admit that you didn't have power, or to give up the candidacy and retain control over the issue, which would have put him in a position, if the war had gone well, to say, I could have done it as well or better. If it didn't go well, he could say you didn't run it right, and he stood apart and let others take up the responsibility and to carry the issue of the war, because they could do it more easily than he could. If he had carried it and lost at the convention, the issue would have gone down with him. By pulling out, he left the issue floating free to be taken up by the party and by Senator Humphrey in a kind of classical move as it went along. And so it was, it was the war, and it finally ended. And I had some reference to Henry Kissinger. Henry's greatest diplomatic achievement was to get the Nobel Peace Prize for watching the end of a war that he'd advocated. I mean, if you're looking for real diplomacy, I've suggested that we might start a move to get the Nobel Prize for McNamara on the grounds that try to retroactively, on the grounds that if he had done what he now says he thought of doing or should have done at the right time, he might have been given credit for ending the war. And we don't really bother with time differences anymore, before and after. Ever since Ronald Reagan, everything has been now. As someone said of an English politician, he imagined the past and remembered the future. Which makes you wonder how he could have Alzheimer's, because all he could forget was what he had imagined. And so we're caught up in these strange sort of cross currents as we went along. And I just, since the McNamara thing sort of leads, I think, or bears on how the war came to be developed, I was suspicious of him. Actually, he didn't vindicate me. I want to make that clear. He's said to have vindicated almost everybody who was either for or against the war. You could have it either way. But there were people responsible for him. Part of our culture, I think, when he came on as Secretary of Defense, it was said that he had a steel trap mind and he knew the numbers. Now, whenever that's said of anyone, you want to be suspicious. People who know the numbers in national politics don't generally work out very well. It was said he made no small mistakes. Another reason to be careful is it gets you looking for small mistakes, and some rather large mistakes can take place or can happen. And he accepted sort of that this was true, and they built him up so that if you were questioning the war, they would say, well, Robert McNamara is for it. And those of us who opposed it were sort of challenged at critical points on about 3 points. One was, well, we were actually challenged at one point of being racist because we wouldn't support a war that involved yellow people, even though we had supported the Korean War before that. Dean Rusk suggested we were unpatriotic and soft on communists, and that our opposition was causing joy in Hanoi, which is one of his more memorable phrases. But it came back to haunt us. So there were suggestions. Actually, Lyndon didn't quite say it. Lyndon would sort of deal with you in the metaphor of handling cattle. It put a kind of a line of detachment between you and him. And a few of us, like George McGovern from South Dakota, Minnesota, we knew something about cattle, which gave us not an advantage over Lyndon, but it put us on somewhat equal grounds, or at least being able to understand him. And that was helpful. In politics, the way you handle cows is different from the way you handle pigs. Now, Ohio would know about pigs. I'm not sure about cattle. But to start cattle, you sing to them. You say you're not going anyplace. You're just going down the road for better grass. And this was sort of the way the Vietnam thing was introduced. Then as you get them closer to where you want them, the cattle, you sort of stampede them so they don't have time to change their mind or think about it very much. And Lyndon, one of his favorite phrases applied to us was, "You fellas cut and ran," which is a bad thing in the military action, but it's not a bad thing if you're a cow. And it's the only way to get out of a stampede. Now with pigs, you have to deal differently. This is sort of an aside, but you have to panic a pig to get them going. You can't start a pig slowly and then speed them up, because they don't take it that way. You got to let them slow down gradually, so when you get them where you want them, they think they've discovered it. And as a rule, that's the way you deal with the Senate. The House is a little bit different, but that's the general framework within which these judgments were made. And as the war came on, it was difficult to challenge. People were afraid. But there were about 4 groups that sort of began to stand up. Just the paper today carried the story of the death of John Bennett, who started the organization of clergy and laity united or concerned about Vietnam. He was head of Union Theological Seminary, and his movement and the first meetings were of such a nature that they couldn't be ridiculed. These were not religious nuts, as they would say of most clergymen who opposed the war very early. But the clergy did very well, and the academic community did very well, and especially the students as it came on. The poets also should be credited for having questioned this war from the very beginning. You got the poets here. Well, they did. They wrote some rather good things. It was too bad some of the administration people weren't reading them. Robert Bly wrote one saying, counting small bone bodies. He said if we could only make the bodies smaller, they'd be easier to count. He said you could get a whole day's kill on a desktop, or you might even use one for a signet ring. Those were hard lines, but they might have moved people who were running the war. Well, there were several poets. Henry Taylor was disturbed by Nixon. I don't think Nixon ever read the poem. It was called Speech. And Henry said, I'm turning on my radio. The president's going to give a speech. I'm lucky I don't have a television set. And then the speech started. And as Henry described it, began dripping out of the loudspeaker, began to spread over the table. Then it began to drip on the floor. And then he said, the flies are gathering. And the flies gathered. And you could hear the meeting, he said, but it was too much for them. He said, the flies are leaving. Well, a line or two from a poem like that, another poem about Nixon. I don't want to get off on it, but it has Nixon watching television. The poet said he's watching it too much. He's watched television too much. He said his eyes suddenly click and roll like the fruit in a slot machine. It was hard to look at Nixon after that for me. I said, this was kind of disturbing. And the 4th group that came in were the soldiers. And this was the people who were in action. And it was a rather curious thing that in Vietnam, when the French were involved in Vietnam and Algeria, their officers complained about what they had to do, and in some reports were practically on the verge of mutiny. In our case, the officers moved along, seemed to make no protest, took their promotions and issued their orders, until finally it was the enlisted men themselves that said, this is not the kind of war we're trained to fight, and what they were called upon to do were things so contrary to, even though it was not very clearly expressed, their code of military action, that they refused to fight and began to turn against the war. So this is sort of the whole picture, or most of it, I guess, as we describe these pictures. And it sort of brings me to what is the theme of this meeting, and you've been addressed on it. What effect did this have on our foreign policy? Well, I don't know about what's gone on in the past. We can look back at that. It was disastrous in terms of what it did to our domestic society. It led to, as has been said to you, we got so we didn't trust the military. The military was corrupted, not just in what they did as soldiers, but in the kind of reporting they did, and they're allowing themselves, the officers at least, to be politicized. by contrast, with Harry Truman, when MacArthur became a political general, he was fired. In Vietnam, Westmoreland was brought back from the field to give a political speech to the Congress, and he seemed to do it quite willingly. MacArthur might have done the same thing if it was something he wanted, but and I didn't know that I'd come to credit MacArthur, but none of the generals stood up and said, we're out of this. MacArthur didn't resign, but he just moved to take over the war himself and got himself fired, which is better than doing nothing. Now, this is a kind of vindication for him to say, I'm not going to fight the kind of war I don't want to fight. I'm going to fight one that's probably worse. But at least he made a kind of officer's commitment to that kind of challenge and that kind of action. So the military were corrupted. The draft procedure was corrupted. The press was corrupted. With John Apple here, I don't like to call up the New York Times, but I usually use the Times because it says it prints all the news that's fit to print. And once you've said that, well, you know, it's like saying I'm infallible. Pope gets in trouble for saying he's infallible, and then he slips a little bit. And so there's a suggestion, you know, that the Times editors got their power when Moses came down with the first unsigned editorial. So I'm not picking on the lesser papers at the Times, but took handouts. What the military gave, what the State Department gave, and sometimes they sort of knew it wasn't true, but they used the cover. They were patriotic papers, sort of like Pravda. We cover for the administration. And the Times on March the 17th of '68 had I had an old professor of historical method, and he said, if you read a historical report that is just too perfect in terms of language and form, mistrust it. Because that's not the way, especially reports of battles, really work out. And so if the report is too perfect, well, you want to be suspicious that it's not true. And some military men try to work this out by writing their own history, which is a pretty good way, or carrying their own historians. But if you can work it so that you can give handouts to others who will print it, you have a kind of one layer of protection between being judged yourself. Well, the Times on March 17th had a story about how 2 American companies had surrounded 128 Viet Cong, held them in a pincer movement while they were shelled from helicopters and killed. This was actually the My Lai massacre. But the March the 17th story, and you could tell it was bad because it was too well written for a military report if you didn't want to use other historical standards for judgment. But this was sort of the mark of the press, that they were covering, or they were saying, we trust the government, and they were handing it to us and to the members of Congress, and we had to sort of run with it. It corrupted the Congress to some extent. In the course of the process, it was a different kind of corruption. The Senate was made into kind of a House of Representatives. The House of Representatives was made into a kind of a pseudo-Senate. We're still really suffering from that. And it developed strange attitudes, I think, that that we still live with. So the idea of my country right or wrong depends on the issue. And once people begin to die, why you apply somewhat different standards. Or the application of politics stops at the water's edge, which was introduced as a reason to silence people and to be quiet. And then beyond that, some of this reflected what McNamara says, the idea of loyalty to the inner circle. He said, I didn't want to expose this until Dean Rusk died. As though he had a loyalty to Dean Rusk, which was set him above or apart from the kind of normal standards of responsible behavior. The inner ring, you have to protect it. And it allows you to do things you wouldn't otherwise do. And beyond that, sort of the murder in the cathedral complex, saying, I know what the president wants, and if I won't ask him because he might have to say no, but I'll do it, and then he'll approve it. And all of this sort of ran through the whole conduct of the war, but was particularly demonstrated, I think, in McNamara's recent revelations, in which the mistakes of the past in judging him, and the mistakes of, not just of judging him, but of the manner in which we judge wars, all sort of came together. I don't want to get off on McNamara again, but apart from making no small mistakes, we should have been suspicious of him because he came in from the automobile industry. Now, at that time, it was sort of believed that the automobile industry could make no mistakes. In fact, Charlie Wilson, who'd been Secretary of Defense under Eisenhower, said what's good for General Motors is good for the country. So if you accept that, then the moral standards of the automobile industry become the acceptable standards for judging government behavior or any kind of behavior in the country. The automobile, if Karl Marx had known about the automobile industry, he would have written another chapter. And said to stimulate capitalism, you need either war or the automobile. And you get the same results from both. Waste of resources and waste of life. And this sort of analogy was even crueler, I guess, than I thought. That Eric Sevareid was interviewing Maxwell Taylor, who was a kind of a White House general. And he said there were like 5,000 people killed in Vietnam last month or last week, whatever Eric said. And Taylor said, well, that's fewer than were killed on the highways. So it would seem as long as you could keep the number of deaths in the war below the number on the highways, that the war was justifiable. And all of these strange kind of standards and justifications were introduced, and we know how the war was conducted. To bring me to kind of the conclusion here of what this has done to us, not in particular foreign policy judgments, but of our place in it. Let's take first of all the killing of the students here. And it really, if we reflect, it put us in a bad way to say very much about the killing of students in Tiananmen Square. The numbers were different, but if you're dealing with ratios and percentages, which was one of the measures of judging Vietnam, it was worse. So how do you protest when you say, what about your own country? And what did you do under the circumstances? And we don't really have an answer. When you talk about the methods that were used to suppress dissent in the United States in the war in Vietnam, about a year ago, I got an album from someone who'd been at Chicago, and it was a rather large album. It had pictures on one side of Chicago and on the other side of Prague. And if it hadn't been for the uniforms and the size of the guns and the tanks, the general picture was pretty much the same in Prague as it was in Chicago. And in fact, when we were flying out after the convention was over, the pilot of the plane said, we are now leaving Prague, which was, and he was a commercial pilot, so someone at least had been affected by the convention. And I heard George, as I was thinking about, saying, you know, how do we defend our usual claim to being concerned about the decent opinion of mankind? Do we bring that up and say, how about it? Or what would be our standing at another Nuremberg trial? If the question of war crimes comes up. So our whole, practically in every area, our moral standing in face-to-face or vis-a-vis the rest of the world has been not altogether destroyed, but significantly damaged by the whole Vietnam experience. And I don't want to leave us with that, because I've been saying I'm sort of tired of anniversaries. It's easier to get people to come to an anniversary now than to a rally. And I'd rather have a few more rallies before I want to celebrate anniversaries. And I think that's true of all of you, I feel like.
Most of us who've retired from teaching at Kent State convinced that there's never been a better faculty than the ones we had when we were here. And those who replace us, or those who succeed us, represent people of a lesser order. Well, the person who's going to speak as a commentator now, Christine Warbeck, belies this so-called truth and has been one of the ornaments of our department for the past 10 years. Dr. Warbeck has a doctorate from the University of Toronto and is a leading scholar in Russian history and a director of our Russian programs. Christine.
Thank you very much. I have some brief comments to make, and I'm very much honored to be here with such an august panel. I will keep my comments, I think, fairly brief to allow the audience some time to ask our guests questions. But what I would like to do is to set the historical context for May 4th, 1970, as well as to provide a sense of what happened to protests thereafter, returning us to the contemporary domestic scene. In the historical continuum, the spring 1970 protests of students at Kent State University and other universities across the United States against the Vietnam War in general and the bombing of Cambodia in particular were not isolated phenomenon. They belong in the history books alongside the student protests and revolutionary activities in the cities of Europe in 1848, when students, intellectuals, and the working classes joined hands momentarily to protest the restrictions on liberty and lack of fundamental rights. Such revolutionary activity stretched from France, which had not yet abandoned all the vestiges of the Ancien Regime, despite a couple of revolutions, all the way to the Habsburg Empire, in which absolutist monarchs ruled. The protests of American students in the 1960s likewise remind historians of the university students of the Russian Empire in the 1860s and 1870s, who created a counterculture, protesting the morals and values of a Russian society that blindly accepted a repressive autocracy. All of these movements are linked to the notion of the university as a place of free learning, idealism, and critical examination of societies past, present, and future. The generations of the 1848 European revolutions and Russian nihilism were bred on the notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the very watchwords of the French Revolution of 1789. Together with the Enlightenment's rediscovery of Athenian democracy and the Roman Republic, and the romantic notions of the Volk or the people, the promises of the French Revolution raised students' political consciousness to reject repression and to seek liberty. Students in American universities in the 1960s, however, were by and large not revolutionaries wishing to overthrow the establishment. Rather, they, or more precisely, the minority who were politically conscious and concerned, were disenchanted with their government and hoped to influence its policies. The civil rights movement of the early 1960s had demonstrated the strength of nonviolent protest that met injustice head-on. African Americans had boldly refused to accept segregation and had chosen instead to demand an integral place in their society. Taking their cue from the successors of the Freedom Marches and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, students in the United States were determined to protest the injustices of an imperialistic superpower that was involved in a war that did not threaten the security interests of the United States, but had propped up a corrupt regime in South Vietnam, resulting in the senseless deaths of Vietnamese and Americans. They were also calling attention to a government that thought nothing of suspending basic civil rights and liberties to fight the communist menace. Brought up by their parents to believe that the United States was the most democratic and free nation on earth, students were disillusioned by police brutality against blacks in the North and South and anti-war demonstrators. These were individuals who sincerely believed in American democracy, but who were unwilling to embrace super-patriotism if that meant an usurpation of liberty. America's engagement in global evangelism unfortunately meant that freedom became associated with the flag and with anti-communism as much as the basic rights of the individual. The great majority of anti-war students either involved themselves in dovish local national political campaigns or participated in campus and community peace demonstrations. Most of them rejected the increasingly violent nature of the Students for a Democratic Society that had grown frustrated with the ineffectiveness of more mild protest. Nonetheless, U.S. student sit-ins and other peaceful protests had immediate international impact, due in large part to global communications. Students across Europe in the 1960s quickly caught onto the image of an imperialist United States refusing to allow the natural decolonization of Indochina and fighting an unjust war against Vietnamese nationalists. They condemned U.S. military participation in Vietnam and American capitalism as they protested their own society's love affair with liberal capitalism. These European students rejected liberalism as a hypocritical ideology that fostered repressive tolerance. Modern capitalist social systems, in their view, contained strong elements of repression and thus had to be scorned. These views questioned everything as they demanded absolute freedom from the complex political and economic realities of democracies. While some carried Lenin's and Mao's writings in their pockets, they did not, however, have tangible alternatives to offer, and their movements eventually fizzled out. Yet before that fizzling, 1968 brought shockwaves to the world. In the United States, the Tet Offensive caused a surge in anti-war activism and resulted in Lyndon B. Johnson announcing that he would not run for re-election. The assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy in April and June 1968, respectively, not only shattered the idealism of Americans, but brought on despair that American society had reached the end of its civilization. These events and the violence at the Democratic National Convention in August 1968 in Chicago overshadowed the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Soviet troops. Student protests mounted precipitously in 1968 and 1969 to culminate in the events at Kent State University in May 1970, Jackson State a few days later, and Wisconsin-Madison later in the summer. Violence at Kent, Jackson State, and Wisconsin brought protests from students at campuses across the nation, but in the long run had the effect of quenching student protest. The anguish that an Oberlin student living in Germany expressed regarding the shootings at Kent symbolized the despair and senselessness of it all. He said, "How do I explain it," meaning the Kent State shootings, "to a European when it sounds to him so much like Prague," of course referring to the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia. Government oppression of liberty was supposed to be a feature of the authoritarian Soviet Union, not the United States. Students became increasingly disillusioned because of the ineffectiveness of their struggle against an increasingly myopic government that continued to lie to the American people. Violence had also upped the ante. One had to be prepared to die for what one believed in. As Alan Canfora has remarked, as an era when masses of people, most of them young, regularly took to the streets to challenge the practices of society, the 1960s ended with a 13-second fusillade in the small Ohio town. Yet the cynicism that the youth of the 1960s felt towards its government and the despair it felt in being ignored by a government that suffered from an arrogance of power, to use the words of Senator J. William Fulbright of Arkansas, did not dissipate with the 1970s. The continued backhand dealings of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, the release of the Pentagon Papers, and the Watergate hearings merely confirmed the bankruptcy of a governmental system that had sacrificed democracy in the name of anti-communism. The generation of the 1960s became largely apolitical, and the apathy with which Americans hold toward their right to vote in a democracy began to set in. More importantly, the exaltation of personal freedom, once directed against racism and a militant foreign policy, became the vehicle for an abandonment of social responsibility. The society retreated significantly from politics and from concern for the distress of others. The me generation took over. Thereafter, protests in American society were confined to non-political concerns, such as the ecology, the dangers of nuclear waste, and leaks of radiation rather than the arms race became focal points of discontent. After the 1973 Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision, heated debate over individual freedoms took the form of demonstrations in support of or against abortion. The protests against American covert operations in Latin America and Iran in the 1970s and 80s were minuscule in comparison, serving as a stark contrast to the heady days of the late 1960s, when students thought that they could make a difference in their society by protesting their government's foreign and domestic policies. Political apathy, distrust of government, and scorn for social responsibility still haunt American society today. In the 1970s and 80s, protest became the preserve of societies under the yoke of authoritarianism. In the late 1970s and 80s, significant groups within Soviet society demonstrated their opposition to their authoritarian regime by not only continuing with their decades-long passive resistance to Soviet propaganda, work ethics, and social values. They also created a counterculture of jazz, rock music, and folk singing, manuscripts that dared criticize the regime, and tapes of American and British rock music circulated underground and in a thriving black market. The hopelessness of the Afghanistan war, often described as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, further galvanized opposition to the regime. The human rights movements, ecological concerns in a country that was continuing to pollute the land and waters of the empire, and demands for a civil society based on the rule of law were also part of the backdrop of the revolutionary reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika were responses to the revolutionary stirrings of the Soviet people and a realization that the bipolarization of the world between two superpowers and subsequent arms race had bankrupted a fragile economic structure. The democratic voices of the Soviet peoples assured, however, that the old political and social structures would fall away, resulting not only in the liberation of Eastern Europe, but the destruction of the old Russian Empire. Further to the east, economic changes and promises of liberalization in China emboldened students in Beijing and other universities to protest the hierarchical structures at the university and the fragility of the job market for highly educated citizens. The protests in China of the mid-1980s took on political overtones as university students complained about foreign economic penetration, the privileges of high-ranking bureaucrats and their families, and corruption in high places. Government repression through arrests, interrogations, punishment, and banning of street demonstrations momentarily succeeded as the student protests of late 1986 and early 1987 were abandoned. Those protests, however, came alive once again in the spring of 1989 in response to the death of an ousted Politburo member who had been widely regarded as a man in favor of a freer political system. On 17 April 1989, a few hundred students of Beijing University went to Tiananmen Square, where every year the regime celebrates the founding of the People's Republic of China. They placed a memorial banner at the base of the monument there to the heroes of the people. They chanted, "Long live democracy, long live freedom, down with corruption, and down with bureaucracy." They subsequently petitioned the authorities, demanding that the campaigns against bourgeois liberalization end and that freedom of speech, assembly, and press be honored. Some other members of Chinese society, office and factory workers, shopkeepers, and professionals joined the students in Tiananmen Square. Who in this world of satellite communication can forget the makeshift replica of the Statue of Liberty in the midst of hundreds of thousands of people demanding liberty? The Chinese Communist Party sent the army in on the night of June 3rd and 4th. The entire world watched the events on CNN as the army charged the peaceful demonstrators. The rebellion was crushed as the Chinese leaders learned the lessons of their economic reforms. While allowing a restructuring of the economy to allow capitalist elements, the regime had to maintain law and order at all costs for its own survival. If history provides us with lessons for the future, it is doubtful that the Chinese Communist Party will be able to survive an economic revolution unscathed. Democratization of the party from within may not stave off a political revolution, as the case of the former Soviet Union has demonstrated. It may only be a matter of time before political turmoil rears its head. In the United States, it is time that Americans re-examine the history of their country over the last 25 years. The publication of Robert McNamara's memoirs regarding his role in the Vietnam War has launched that serious re-examination. Whether one sides with those who castigate or applaud Mr. McNamara's admission that the war was wrong is beside the point. Debate about this tragic period and its consequences is a healthy and necessary feature of American society. The bombing of Oklahoma City also forces the American people to assess their distrust of government and political apathy. The fact that the distrust of government can be traced to the late 1960s and early 1970s demands not only a reassessment of that period, but also a deeper understanding of why feelings of American inferiority and humiliation as a result of the Vietnam War resulted in the discrediting of liberalism and furthering of American jingoism rather than its abandonment. During the Nixon and later Reagan administrations, the readiness to denounce Soviet perfidy whenever it raised its head, and indeed to attribute to Soviet malevolence the major ills of the times, whether or not there was any degree of Soviet responsibility, blinded the United States to the realities of a multipolar world. The changes in the developing world as countries have shed the yoke of Western imperialism, and the tensions and transformations that are occurring as a result of a revival of nationalist movements would not be so surprising to American society. The fact that the crusade against the evil empire was as much an attack on the welfare state because of its socialist implications and liberalism needs to be recognized. As the United States grapples with its place in a post-Cold War world order, and as it agonizes over major questions of social responsibility, it must also grapple with its history of the past 25 years.
We do have a little time for questions, but I'm going to suggest that those of you who will be attending the reception before the May 4th Scholarship Benefit Dinner might wish to talk with our speakers on that occasion, but let's spend a few minutes at least with some questions. Yes.
I'm a teaching assistant in communication studies, and often my students and I get into a discussion about the incidents around May 4th. And one constant question, comments from the students is, why should we care? We weren't there, we weren't alive, it's in our past, we don't remember it. Yes, we should study history, we should learn from the past, but how do we get over this apathy? How can I instill in my students the fact that what happened on May 4th is important, and what can I teach them about the future? Thank you.
Gentlemen?
I'm not the teacher here.
For the moment you are.
But I find it difficult to believe that if they have any interest in history whatsoever, they would not, their interest could not be aroused by something that is so directly connected to their own experience. First of all, it's Kent State. Second, they're students. And third, it had to do with the repression of free inquiry, which presumably is what, and free expression, which is presumably what they're here for. If they're here for none of that, then you're in trouble.
My freshman in high school, I want to know, we don't really talk too much about the Vietnam War. Why was Cambodia bombed? Is there a reason, or was it just out of the blue?
I'll take a shot at that. No pun intended there. Well, the rationale that was developed at the time by the administration is that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were using Cambodia as an area to move in supplies. They were using it as a staging area for attacks in South Vietnam. It was also said to be a kind of an escape area for troops and guerrillas that were pursued by the Americans. Beyond that, the administration said that there was a kind of a master headquarters in Cambodia, that indeed it might be the Pentagon, sort of the central command authority directing all of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese operations in the South. As possibly you know, when our troops moved in there, they couldn't find anything except a few bags of rice. No headquarters, no Pentagon, nothing of that kind. And up until that point, Cambodia had been more or less a neutral country in the struggle. So I think both on military and political and moral and the grounds of international law, the whole thing was a huge blunder. It didn't change the outcome of the war in any way except to further demoralize the Sihanouk government and perhaps contribute eventually to the collapse of Prince Sihanouk and the emergence of a really murderous Khmer Rouge group in Cambodia that turned on its own people.
George, I think, too, that it was sort of demonstrating that they could bomb and accomplish things by it which had not been accomplished by the Democratic administration, and had failed to bomb North Vietnam. Some of the militarists said that was our mistake, and so when they got Cambodia, Nixon said, let's bomb Cambodia. Actually, he didn't say it. They asked Admiral Moore about that, and he said he didn't order the bombing. He said the standing order was to bomb everything, and all the president had to say, the standing order is not in effect. So gravity was primarily responsible. And I felt better when that happened, because I was one of two people who voted against confirming Moore as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the other was Steve Young from Ohio. Old Steve. The reason we gave was Moore had been involved in a controversy about making cadets go to religious services, and he said only Christians made good fighters. And I thought that was a high-risk position for him to take if he were chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But the other thing interesting about Cambodia was that it introduced a new term into American history. It was called an incursion. It's the first incursion in our history. It was rather interesting. You know, you wonder about these militarists, and every so often they surprise you with some intelligence and stuff. And the word incursion, you say, what about it, you know? And the explanation that I've given is that there's no verb for it. You can't incurse. So it was kind of a happening. They said, well, an incursion, yeah, it's an incursion going on, and it'll end, and nobody's responsible. It's existential. And since that time, this was kind of a generic naming of a military action. They thought of calling Grenada an incursion, but it went so fast they decided to call it an invasion. And these people are into language. You really, and now they name wars in advance, you know, particular wars. Desert Storm. Used to let a war kind of name itself, where it was, how long it lasted, what it was about, who ran it. Desert Storm was named in advance, and Rolling Thunder was the battle. And it worked on television. It only conflicted a little bit with the weather reports, but otherwise it was but they're naming the war in advance, which is a new control over history.
I'm going to have to hold here.
Yes, this is for both Mr. Apple and Senator McGovern. You seem to agree that the war was a result of ignorance. In Mr. Apple's case, you said it was ignorance that Vietnam wasn't really the linchpin of the Cold War. And in Senator McGovern's case, it was ignorance that Ho Chi Minh wasn't a nationalist. And I guess I could find that plausible if this had only happened once. But I think of the Philippines and the Dominican Republic and Nicaragua and Argentina and El Salvador and Iran and indeed Indonesia, which was one of the dominoes that didn't fall, but I suppose from the point of view of the Timorese might well have. Given that history and what seems to me a pretty steady consistency in U.S. policy, shouldn't we rather see the point of the Vietnam War to be to squash nationalism? I mean, is there any evidence for what seems indeed to be an absolute article of faith in the views that get into the press, that if the war was wrong at all, it was the ignorance of virtue? I mean, is there any reason to believe that?
Well, I don't agree with most of your assumptions. First of all, we didn't fight wars in most of those places.
Yes, all but Indonesia, every one of them.
Oh, you're referring to long ago. When was our war in Argentina?
We trained troops. We sent planes equipped with nuclear weapons to nearby states. We sent weapons into the country. You know, we didn't have, our troops didn't physically invade, although they did even further ago. But we were clearly militarily involved in the toppling of a democratic government.
Let's not have a discussion on the nature of war. It seems to me we're at war when we send our troops to fight in the hundreds of thousands. I see no evidence whatsoever that the war in Vietnam was fought to suppress nationalism. I am not as Machiavellian perhaps as you, but all of my experience in Vietnam and in Washington, I might say that Eugene McCarthy's description of what the New York Times reported from Vietnam was highly selective, to say the least. We were so critical of the war that Lyndon Johnson tried to get me sacked as the Saigon bureau chief. Shake your head if you like. We sent correspondents to Hanoi, who reported exactly what was happening when no other newspaper sent them, et cetera, et cetera. My feeling is that it was a failure, not of goodwill at all, but a failure of incompetence. I think the war was incompetently fought, incompetently conceived, incompetently justified.
If I could just say a word on that, since the question was directed partly at me. I suppose I have a natural inclination when I disagree as strongly as I did with the policymakers in Vietnam. It's just a little easier for me to assume that the people who disagree with me are acting out of ignorance rather than evil. Maybe both of those statements are a little on the arrogant side, but I really think that Vietnam was the natural outgrowth of the assumptions that had guided the Cold War almost from the beginning. An assumption that we were up against an international communist movement very similar to Hitler's aggressions in World War II. People said we can't forget the lessons of Munich. You have to stand up against these major dictators right at the beginning, whether it's Czechoslovakia or Vietnam or wherever it is. And I believe that was an ignorant approach to what we were up against in the post-Cold War period. I suppose it's somewhat more understandable that you could have held that view early on in the Cold War, before it became clear that there were ruptures, there were differences, there was no such thing as an international communist monolith where all communists worldwide were taking their orders out of either Peking or Moscow. But I do think that people from Harry Truman on down really thought that it wasn't simply that we were opposing Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, but that was the first shot in an international challenge to our position all around the world, and it was being orchestrated out of Peking and Moscow. We now know that's a mistaken view, but at the time it was not so hard for people who had swallowed the basic Cold War philosophy to assume that Vietnam was the place where we had to stand. A tragically mistaken judgment, but I think one that wasn't produced so much out of evil as it was just out of a misreading of what was going on and the forces that were moving in that part of the world.
I think that's right. You have to give them credit for a lot of ignorance instead of bad will. And there's so much confusion there. You couldn't think there was that much just bad will that would have gotten us into it. Although at each time we increased our commitment of men in power, we, whoever, gave another justification. The first was support of the French. The second was civil war in the South, the Kennedy people. Then there was invasion from the North. Then the Chinese were coming, as Russ said, to be 1 billion of them by the year 2000. And then they finally said, we're into what George said, the safety and security of the whole free world. Was progressively, and I heard another justification at a recent meeting with Walt Rostow and General Westmoreland, said that it was saving what they call the Asian area. I didn't know where that was. It turns out to be southwestern Asia, that they say they were really there to save all of Indochina from being taken over by the Vietnamese. And that's the new justification. It's sort of like saying we want to keep the straits open so Vasco da Gama can make it, you know. I mean, you say this thing is about that much reason to it.
I'm going to suggest just one more question, and I think if you want to talk perhaps afterwards. Okay, so.
This is for Senator McGovern. It's in part because of his affiliation with the Kennedy brothers. President Kennedy, a lot of people saw in Vietnam, no matter who they were there trying to figure out how to win the war in Vietnam. How do we win? I mean, we couldn't leave until we won. And I thought it was interesting because in 1967 or 1968, Senator Robert F. Kennedy quoted his brother John as saying that our participation in Vietnam should never be to win or lose. It is not our war to win or lose, and we should never become the central fighting effort. And Robert Kennedy always took offense at people who portrayed his brother as being more enthusiastic about the war in Vietnam. To be objective, I would say yes, 4 or 5 years after your brother's dead, it's convenient to rewrite his view of the war in Vietnam, because I thought that was a brilliant view. From your knowledge of the Kennedy brothers, how would you characterize John Kennedy's view of the war in Vietnam?
Well, I can only tell you what was happening while he was alive. I noticed that Mr. McNamara now speculates that if John Kennedy had lived, that he would not have accelerated the war, at least not after the '64 election, assuming he was reelected. That has to be considered almost pure speculation, because the record that I'm familiar with, and I say this as one who had a long-time personal affection for President Kennedy, is that he was committed. to our military involvement there, that he accepted essentially the domino theory, that if we didn't stand there, we'd be challenged elsewhere around the world, and that he bought the view that American credibility was on the line, the prestige of American arms was on the line, and that we had to stand. Now, I will qualify that by saying two things. Number one, in September of 1963, at a major press conference, President Kennedy said, just a couple of months before he was killed, that in the last analysis, this is a Vietnamese war. It's their war. They're the ones that must win or lose it. He said, we can send some men out there, we can send some assistance, but it's their war, and they must win or lose it. And I think it was several expressions like that that probably led Secretary McNamara to believe that this was a kind of a forewarning, that President Kennedy did not intend to get deeply involved in any kind of a major escalation there. But because of his death 2 months later, we never can really be certain about that. What we can be certain is that President Johnson kept on the whole Kennedy team. Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, Walt Rostow, they all, Bill Bundy, they all stayed in place. And I have no doubt that Lyndon Johnson thought that he was carrying on the policies of his predecessor. There again, we're getting into the realm of the speculation here. There's only one other supporting item in my mind along McNamara's view that President Kennedy might have balked at further escalation and have tried to wind down the war. I do think President Kennedy had supreme self-confidence. He grew up in a wealthy home. He was educated in Ivy League schools. He was a graceful, handsome young man, and everything going for them. He probably didn't have any sense of personal inferiority or insecurity. I'm not so sure that that was true with either Lyndon Johnson or President Nixon. I think they had some real personal insecurities, and were not quite as sure of who they were as Kennedy was. And people with those kinds of personal insecurity find it much harder to admit that we're on a wrong course and change direction. Alexander Pope once said, to admit you're wrong is another way of saying you're wiser today than you were yesterday. I think probably President Kennedy had a little more personal resources to accept that than perhaps his two successors. But I again add, this is pure speculation on my part.
I think, George, I think it's right that there's some reason to say that Kennedy might have done it. I generally suspect people who quote the dead. You know, I see, they tell you what the dead would have done. Clinton the other day said that Roosevelt would have been for his tax program. I don't know about that. He said that John Kennedy would have been for NAFTA. If you really have connections like that, you don't use them on minor issues. You know, you got to keep them around for something really, really big. And we had that during the battle over the Vietnam War. Larry O'Brien was Postmaster General. He dedicated a 15-cent stamp one day to General Marshall. And he said if Marshall were alive, he'd be for the war. That was when Johnson was still running. When Bobby came in, Larry supported Bobby. And I saw him. I said, did General Marshall change his mind? Is he you're going to cancel the stamp, you know, and put out something else? And then when Humphrey took over the campaign, Larry was back with General Marshall, or General Marshall was back with him. And you wonder about it. I mean, we had a candidate for the presidency who one year said he talked to his dead brother, but he said he wouldn't use his stuff. Now, that's an honest kind of approach, I think.
Well, on Senator McCarthy's necrophilic note, let's conclude with our thanks to all the speakers today.
At the Air Force Cemetery near Cambridge.
I think there's a press conference.
On this date, 25 years ago, about 3,000 students gathered near the Kent State University Commons to protest the U.S. invasion of Cambodia. Ohio National Guardsmen fired on the crowd, killing 4 and injuring 9. Today on C-SPAN, counterterrorism legislation is the subject of a hearing by the Senate Judiciary Terrorism Subcommittee.